Hey, Mason, welcome. Catching up.
Yeah, it's great to see you. It's been
Hey,
too long.
what are you covering this week? What are you thinking about?
So this week, I'm thinking about what can educators and managers learn from classical conductors based on a conversation I heard. Super interesting stuff. And we also dig into junior republics, a pretty unbelievable part of American history that has been pretty much lost to time. How about
I
you?
am excited to hear about that. I know nothing about Junior Republic. I wanted to share a bunch of things on a deep dive. So really interested in Indiana charter micro schools that have one launched last year or a plan last year and it's launching into next year. And thinking about the purpose of schools, really small questions about tribalism versus the common good. And then I'm interested in this global flourishing study, and can that be a common profile of a learner? So we'll talk a little bit about that and the 6 different characteristics that they found when they surveyed everybody. And then we're going to dive into the importance of project management skills starting in kindergarten all the way up through grade 12 to really set up young people for success. And we really just don't do enough in that area. So it's going to be an exciting show today. If you're listening, bear with us. It's a long show, but there's a lot of good information in it today. And then stick around for the music at the end.
As always, yep. All right, let's jump in.
Let's jump in.
We're catching up, oh, catching up to futures bright, but oh, so abrupt.
How was your vacation? Yeah, it sounds like you went backpacking and hiking and things like that.
It was really good. It was a lot of socializing, but also a lot of outdoor time.
What did you learn about the ecosystem you were walking in that you didn't know before? Anything?
So apparently, the fish in Washington are very hard to catch. My younger brother has been fly fishing a lot in Colorado and has gotten very good at catching them, and he caught none while he was up here, and is like
Uh,
this. And he bought specific flies, so I think that's a pretty big learning. I also had never seen as many starfish as I saw this break.
Starfish are really cool. Do you know how they eat? Have you read that?
This is actually a formative part of my relationship with my wife. Yes, we were
Oh, I can't wait to hear that story.
we,
Go.
we we were just out. We were at low tide, and there was a starfish there. And I googled how do starfish eat because I had that question. I learned it, and it was pretty amazing. And so I was like, "Oh, Danielle, like, do you know how starfish eat?" And she's like, "No, I don't." And then as I start saying it, she just starts completing my sentence, and she's like, "I guess I did." And then like it comes up all the time whenever one of us finishes the other person's sentence. It's just like starfish eating. Yeah,
And don't
they
they like
basically
it? They invert their stomachs, right? They put their stomachs out and then they digest and suck it back in again. All right. On that note, that's our learning for today. What are the things you've been seeing, learning? What's on your mind?
This will come up a couple times, I think. So, building on something we said last time, though, there's this idea of like portals to the future, right? Where you sort of live the future now, and that makes it feel more real and something that actually may come to fruition, or you could like prototype living there. I was listening to this conversation, which I'm gonna bring back. It was Tyler Cowen was interviewing the classical composer David Robertson, and
Hmm.
he was talking about whenever his orchestra is struggling with a piece, he says something that his mentor taught him, which is like, in order to play the part of the song, you have to have it in your brain exactly perfect how you want to hear it, and then you will be able to play it. And I think it's just so interesting when all these ideas sort of when they coalesce later down the line. Like the future portals thing, very fun to live in a portal to the future. But something about the actual performance element of being able to do something only once you've been able to fully make how you want it to be so vivid. So,
There's something about wiring there that must happen in our
yeah.
neurons, right? Is that you listen to something long enough and that it gets wired in a certain, I mean, you and I both play music. And if I know this, obviously, if you know the song, it's easier to play it if you're playing a cover for someone. But there has to be some interesting wiring that happens. But the idea of playing it back. So if you have to think in your head about what a song sounds like and that sounds correct, that's
Yeah,
interesting to me.
totally. I agree.
So interesting. Yeah, I've got a couple of my just interesting things. As I think you and I both met him, David Hirsch, who started this group called In Tandem, which is a nonprofit that's really looking at allowing students to provide feedback to all sorts of things in education, and that could be new products, new processes, whatever the case may be. Some place where those who are working in education need feedback from students,
Right.
and so he's created this group called In Tandem that help students work on project or help coalesce the students around projects that are needed in the environment. So real world learning experiences, feedback groups, feedback sessions. And I just thought it was really interesting. I think it matches, we know that ASA Teen Voice is that async platform that allows you to get good feedback really quickly from teens, especially, but students who are the main users and learners. And it was a good reminder for me that the work that he's doing, the work that ASA is doing, it is easier than ever to get feedback from young people. And young people are the primary recipients of any changes we make in education. So we have no excuses to not work with and co-design with and ask good questions of young people when we're designing for young people. Make sense?
Totally. I think that's a great learning and a good provocation for everyone in our audience.
Yeah. And we need to do more of that. I love, you and I have talked a lot about how do we get student voice in schools tours, for example. Like how are we helping people see the schools from the students' eyes rather than some sort of polished view of a school or district that says, this is the great things we're doing, et cetera. But what is the real world vision of a student who's going through the school on a day-to-day basis? And I know there's a leadership exercise, and I did it when I was a school leader, where you would just spend the day shadowing one student. And that shadow of student day was super interesting because you realize you go class to class, and the breaks between class were a frenzy. And you ended up as adults being really, really tired at the end of the day when you truly shadowed a student. So that was early options of getting feedback. Of course, there's been surveys, but I love the idea of students who are getting either compensated for or building experience around giving their expert advice to those adults who are building in the space.
Yeah, I love that too.
What else is on your mind? What else did you see this week or last couple of weeks?
I just saw this report. It made me curious and built on some stuff we talked about. So I wanted to highlight it since we're sort of following certain trends throughout these conversations. There was a report from UPCEA, that was talking about the effect of employer understanding on non-degree credentials. I think that is also the title of the report. And in general, it was showing that organizations are super curious about credentials. But some statistic that stood out to me is that they really want to collaborate on making them. So it said that 73% of employers surveyed want to be extremely or very active in the curriculum design if they were to partner with higher education. Yet only 44% of them had ever been approached by a college or university.
Yeah.
So I think this is building on this theme of co-creation, and also something I saw a lot when I was researching more like sustainability jobs is how much unions wanted to be involved in the actual teaching of skills and competencies, because a lot of the time they're on the hook for how something goes. So I just think that this is an interesting piece, this invitation, the potential for community weaving kind of to build relationships between organizations in higher ed and hopefully K-12 as well. It just stood out to me.
It makes me think. I was listening to a podcast on state of CTE and how the formal designation of high demand pathways is important in more and more states. So districts get better points if students are graduating in a high demand pathway as determined by local industry or regional industry or state industry, which makes total sense. But the barrier there was that the process to determine what is a high need pathway was really slow. So it was like 2 to 5 years process. And so there was no industry can change really quickly. You could have a new company or a new industry emerge in a state, and that's going to be faster than maybe a 2 to 5 year shift. And so this goes back to how do we reduce the bureaucracy so that when an employer says, hey, I want to be involved because I have a pathway that needs to exist or a credential that needs to exist or curriculum that would be really helpful.
Totally.
How do they quickly, kind of like in tandem for the students version, we need an in tandem version for employers where they can constantly be putting feedback into a school district to say, hey, this is what we need right now. And then the school district has the ability, both policy wise and resource wise, to pivot quickly to make sure that every student is graduating with something that's meaningful in the moment rather than that was meaningful a couple of years ago. So it's interesting connections, and it'll be interesting if certainly there are solutions. We know that there are employers that are talking to higher ed and talking to K-12. That's not novel, but as a routine, I'm not sure it's super popular in the ecosystem right now.
Yeah, no, great ideas. I think you could also learn from, in that process, you could also learn as an employer or the person designing the credential, like what is working from other credentials. If you had this sort of employer in tandem and you could offer feedback like, oh, we built one, but like we found out that this actually wasn't a useful criteria for saying that they are capable of doing this work or something. So long-term, it could also shape what it actually means to be a credential, as well as helping build these pathways, which I know you and I think about all the time.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Hey, the last thing I was thinking about was Gallup did a survey, and this was reported out about 74 million, is that they were surveying the last year, so 24-25 school year, educators and on AI use. And so the data suggested that 60% of those responding used AI this year, and that saved up to 6 hours of work. per week. The other data points that were interesting in the survey were that 19% of schools had an AI policy. So less than 20% had an AI policy. The other 80 did not. And then 68% of educators received no training in AI. I think the last two, the policies will emerge. I'm not too concerned about that. I think there's a lot of cookie cutter work that can happen on that, and policies are going to be pretty straightforward. And I think more and more outfits are out there doing development and professional learning on AI. So I actually don't think that that's going to be a big challenge to overcome. What I am interested in is the 60% of teachers used AI and saved up to 6 hours of work a week. And so my question is to you is, and to our listeners is, all right, well, you're saving this time. So what happens? And I guess I see two options. One is educators are already overburdened. This is going to make their lives more realistic and more reasonable and things like that. And I applaud that. I understand that. It's really hard to be a teacher. On the other hand, if you start saving more and more time because of efficiency, there are opportunities, as you and I have talked about, building better relationships, doing more projects, doing more real world work, et cetera. So I'm very curious as we see 25, 26 come across and 26, 27 is this, I suspect we're going to see more and more time saving to some sort of plateau, but what are we going to replace it with? So that's one of the things I was thinking about as I was reading that particular blog post.
Yeah, no, I think that is the right question. Sitting with this 6 hours of work, and even if you agree, I think a lot of this is probably extra outside of the sort of typical domain of teacher hours, like 40 hours a week or whatever. But assuming you get those back within sort of your working day, does that actually make space for you to interface more with students? Does that make space for you to implement more rigorous, like project-based learning experiences? Yeah, super interesting. Great survey. And I wonder, like, did you happen to see who the participants are? Is this people who are sort of going to be, does it have a good swath of districts across the country?
I think it's distributed well, statistically relevant. I mean, Gallup
Cool.
did it, so I assume they're
They do a good
statistically
job.
significant across multiple demographics, et cetera, et cetera. But I didn't look at the research, the actual research design of this particular one. So
Cool.
All right, let's do a couple deep dives. Maybe I'll start out, Mason. I am super interested in what's happening in Indiana with these charter micro schools. And so let's do a little bit of framing here. So we at Getting Smart, and you and I have talked a lot about micro schools. In the last couple of years, micro schools have really emerged in the private sector, as especially post-COVID, as an R&D experiment, and trying to serve families better if their kids weren't being served in the either existing public or existing private system. So they started these small little micro schools. But really, we've been pushing hard on this idea of public micro schools, right? How can you create similar scenarios, but not in the private sector, so that they can be accessible by all? And Indiana passed a law that allowed a network of micro schools to be part of a charter network, which is the first in the country that has allowed this. There are some other examples. So you could look at ASU Prep, which is a charter school, public charter school in Arizona. They run a charter network. Some of those, they do have micro schools, but those micro schools are not standalone. They're part of their ASU Prep digital charter school. So, right. So there are examples of that, but these are actually standalone micro schools that are authorized as charters. Another example that already exists is Purdue Polytech, right? Like they have their labs, their micro school that started. It is a school as part of a charter network. So that's a little bit closer to Indiana and probably based on a similar set of flexibilities. But in this case, the Indiana Charter Micro Schools is going to be ideally a network of public micro schools that are available, community driven, available to all students, and they want to have hundreds around the state of Indiana. So when you dig into this, the first one is going to open this fall, so a month and a half from now. It's in partnership with a public school district called Easton Hancock Schools. This is George Philhauer, who we know and doing really interesting, innovative work. And the sense is that there were students that were not coming into the public system and yet wanted some sort of schooling for that was free in public. And so he used this law in partnership with the Indiana Micro School Collaborative and Scott Bess and others on that team to say, hey, we can actually create a public micro school. They're calling it Nature's Gift Micro School. It's east of Indianapolis, and it's in his district, in partnership with his district, but it's trying to pull students back into the system who may have pulled out of the system, either via homeschool or other private school options. And so I think it's super interesting as an opportunity. I'll be very curious to see if states follow this, and whether or not there's a trend of ESA states following it, those who are with education savings accounts, or non-ESA states pushing and promoting this as an alternative to ESAs. So interesting, plays on the public micro school playbook that we co-wrote, and just think that there's a lot of opportunity when you see policy starting to allow for really interesting models. It's exciting for me.
Yeah, that's incredible work. And we love George. If you didn't catch the podcast that we did with him a couple months ago, be sure to check it out. Just a super joyful and amazing individual.
Yeah, and it goes contrary to this idea that school choice is always going to be contrary to the interests of the local public school district. And I think there's sometimes when they are at odds and they're butting heads. And in my neck of the woods, when we tried to open a public charter school in the late 90s, it was approved by the local. It needed to be approved by the local district, and it just wasn't. It was not. There was too much divisiveness around it. But I like the idea of how does everybody see it as an asset, and especially those in bringing people back into the public system in a way that makes sense, because that benefits everybody, I think.
Totally. This fits into our abundance versus scarcity conversations we've been
This
having
is
a lot.
Absolutely an example of abundance. That's exactly right. So that's my deep dive. What else is on your deep dive list?
Okay, so I heard about this, another past podcast guest, Rachel Davidson Humphreys. We had her on a handful of years ago from the Bill of Rights Institute. And I was hanging out with her and some other folks this weekend. And she told me about this thing called the Junior Republics. Do you know about these?
I saw it in our show notes, and I have no idea what it is. So you got to help me.
So you probably have some cursory familiarity of this, being kind of in the Massachusetts area where you grew up. But a recent book came out, I think it was in like 2021, 2020, for Jennifer Light, called The States of Childhood, and it's from MIT Press. We'll put a link in the show notes. There's a free version online. But I'm going to do a little bit of quoting from her because these things are awesome and I want to get her words. So these junior republics were the brainchild of the philanthropist William R. George, and the first one was the George Junior Republic from 1895. So this happened turn of the century, 2 centuries ago. And in the Baedeker guides, it said, travelers should be sure to visit the curious community in Freeville, New York, where boys and girls are in charge. This miniature republic, modeled on the government in the United States, is well worth a detour to observe the legislature, courthouse, jail, school, church, and public library, which is exclusively staffed by citizens aged 14 to 21, most of them immigrants and impoverished youth. In these towns, they basically made it so you age out at 21 and you live there from the ages of 10 to 21. Sometimes you could be like 5 and younger, but they were a response to child labor laws. So they started up as a way to be like, hey, so students aren't working anymore, but like, we actually think this is really important for building life skills. What we're going to do is create these environments that are safer because it's all young people, and also let them do these really real world skills. And these lasted for like 60 years, and they had more than 1,000 of these across the United States. So they are these youth only, they spread to Europe, and they ended up having basically these young people made their own laws. They sat for civil service exams. They paid all the taxes. They constructed all the buildings, ran all the hotels and restaurants. They brought in news media to cover like what they were doing there. And they're just these full-time cities that are exclusively staffed by young people. So it came up in the context of agency, of course, as we were talking about it this weekend. And I had no idea that these existed. And it was so wild that we've come so far from that idea now. To even suggest anything like this would be an absolute nightmare to try and like legislate or make the case for.
I have so many questions, Mason. So okay. So first of all, is it a boarding school situation where they or are they living in their family homes with their families, etc.? That's my first question.
No, it's just youth. There is no families. So they all move out into the city that has been built for young people. And then the young people also build.
Okay. What years was this again?
Started in 1895 and then sort of petered out after the Second World War, because these towns were very big on like providing a lot of wartime goods. It almost felt like a home economics like hub during the war for doing all kinds of canned goods, rations, materials.
Okay, and did they spend their entire days in these places? You're gonna become an expert really quickly because I'm gonna ask you all these questions and you're gonna have to pretend to know them.
I'm gonna have to pretend to know them. They spent all their days in the places. There's like very little research on these, and I haven't read the full book yet. So I think that there were versions of this where it was an all year thing. And sometimes in the Northeast, it would maybe be like a summer program where they'd send people up there. And then over time, they became something a little different. So they transitioned by the end, but specifically this first, the George Junior Republic, which later became Freeville, New York, was one of these places that was year round. All these people figuring it out.
And then did they go home to their families at night, do you think? Or
They
it
did
was
not.
only
No.
they were, and there must be was there any adult supervision?
From what I could see, no. Aside from like media coming in on occasion.
Okay. It's kind of, I feel like there's a little bit Lord of the Flies possibilities here as well. I really want to know research on this. I'm looking at AI right now, and certainly it's like self-governance, civics engagement, economic independence, educational opportunities. You're right. This would never fly today, I don't think.
Right.
Really interesting and focused on students that impoverished or in
Justice
in
system.
judicial
Yeah.
justice system, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What else do you know about them? What else have you learned?
I mean, I think that it was really interesting the ways in which first it was a response to child labor, as I said. This became
Yeah.
a place to kind of do vocational school and also build life skills. From what I could tell, there wasn't a lot of negative reporting on this. Like there weren't a lot of places where this really blew up and floundered. It actually was like a pretty great model, so much so that, like I said, it scaled into Europe and that they kind of took it and ran with it much longer than the United States did. The people have tried to start it since then, and it just like hasn't worked for a number of reasons, like the ones that we've just talked about, whether that be safety, whether that be the child labor laws kind of
Yeah.
questioning it again. But they said that it resulted in this kind of footprint of both being almost entirely forgotten, like nobody talks about this,
Yeah.
and these scattered miniature communities. So I think I'm going to butcher a German word, but it's a Kinderspielstadt in Germany is a version of this that
Yeah.
I think is still ongoing. There's some safety villages in Canada that are a version of this. They're like small scale villages so that young people can learn how to like navigate a city safely and how to do exchanges. When I was in elementary school, we had something called Exchange City, which was like a faux city in a building for like learning economics, but at much smaller scale. We went for like one day, one time in elementary school.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so
It's
it's
like
just
classroom economies. There's all these off spins of this where
right.
students are trying to mimic. I'm going to use I'm getting a little bit bothered by the use of real world because I think students live in the real world. They don't not live in the real world, but I'll use the
Right.
real world. But just mimicking the adult world is probably the right way to say it. All right. Fascinating. I think we need to both maybe read this book or listen to some podcasts by Jennifer Light because this looks
I'm going to have
super
her on, I
interesting.
think, because I have a lot of questions and truly poking around was there's a fun video on YouTube I'll put in the show notes that shows some early video footage of people navigating these towns. And it's just so funny how kids all dressed up like adults anyway, even though they
Right.
were on their own. So it's very interesting how the times sort of bred young people acting like older people, not young people having full agency to do whatever they want.
Right.
But yeah, super, super interesting. And I just continue to be amazed that we overwrite things in history and then always think we're inventing something new when it's like, no, the most radical version of this already happened.
Think about all the things we talk about, right? So it is the real world. So it's real world learning in the ultimate sense of that word. It is gaining experiences, real world experiences, full on agency. And when you think about where it sits, 1900 and 1945, right? It's after the advent of more sort of universal formal schooling. So some of this is probably a reaction to the industrialized model of every student having really no agency and trying to create the sameness across the education system. And then, disappears after World War II. And we have sort of some times of ups and downs, some real progressive open schools movement, and then more back to the sort of basics and more traditional models of school. And now here we are in 2025, we're talking about real world learning, like, wow, real world learning, we should all do this. And yet, like you said, there are so many, all education was real world when it first started, right? Like when humans were during human evolution and early communities and tribes, et cetera. But you're right, tend to think these things are brand new, and we have to just do some reminders to ourselves about, what's happened in the past before we start reinventing over and over again.
Absolutely. And I love the civics implications of this. The fact that the students were running the civic system and the sole electorate and that's why they were called republics, is because it was all kind of self-contained within what these young people, who they were electing, how they were going through that process.
We talked about world of work programs all over the place, and this feels like the ultimate representation of world of work. You actually are doing the work. You're not just exploring it. So, all
Absolutely.
right, more to come on that. I think that is something I had no idea, and I love that when we catch up.
Yep.
All right, I'm going to pivot to sort of this bigger idea of, and I think you just came back from this conversation around civic thriving, thinking about what is the state of civics in the United States and democracies, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm intrigued by this Global Flourishing Study, and we'll
Yep.
put it in the show notes. And they surveyed a couple 100,000 people across 20 countries. And they asked some really basic questions about what's the most important thing for you to thrive, right? So, or to flourish. And then they coalesced it into and integrated it into a set of 6 different elements. And they're pretty self-explanatory, and I'll just list them off for our listeners. And they're self-explanatory, and they're actually kind of obvious to me. This makes sense, is that for me, when I read this list of 6, it makes sense that I would be flourishing if I was at 100% in all these. So first one is material and financial stability. I am financially secure. Second one is happiness and life satisfaction. I'm satisfied with my life. Third one is mental and physical health. I'm safe and healthy. Fourth one is meaning and purpose. I find meaning and purpose in my life. Fifth one is character and virtue. I have a strong moral character. And the 6th is I have close social relationships. I have strong relationships with people. And this ties on a lot of the research that you and I have talked about, and that we're writing about at Getting Smart, is how important different elements of this are. We need to make sure that there is financial security. You need to have mental and physical health, there's purpose, good character and moral set, and then social relationships. And how do we make sure that students have the good connections that they need to thrive in the world? So all that being said is, okay, there's a couple 100,000 people across 20 countries. There's some merit that this is reasonable for what I'm thinking about is, can't we just have a global portrait of a learner? And just use these 6 so that we avoid some of the messiness of trying to create over and over again. Now, I understand that it's really important to own the portraits that we create, and the communities need to own them. But I'm super interested with how these 6 can really be a data-formed way to say, does your portrait of a graduate or a profile of a learner make sure that it is leading towards these things? Because some of them really bend towards financial as maybe the only or the most important. And I understand if you don't have financial security, the rest of these are really difficult to have. I think that's real, and we need to acknowledge that. But I think it could operate as a little bit of, use the word in an earlier meeting today, a little bit of a calibration for portraits to say, hey, are we actually headed in this direction? So I don't know. You've probably seen the study, I think. And what are your thoughts on it?
No, I think it's a really great study. I mean, I think similarly to you, the sort of unsurprising nature of it was what was surprising to me. I think anytime somebody sees something like this, they're looking for an answer to something that they don't have an answer for, which is like, and it doesn't give you that. It doesn't say like here. It doesn't necessarily say like these are the core pathways to getting satisfied in your life. Like that, those are not the real result of this. Aside from you can extrapolate some micro data from things people filled in, but I mean, it made me think a long time ago, we had on the person who started the gross national happiness index in Bhutan.
Oh, yeah.
And I just ran it through Jim and I as we were talking, but like these are super aligned with sort of how they do that calibration. And I think that's a really unique example of actually trying to codify this language into something that's measurable to then say like how an economy or a place is actually doing on the whole. How is Bhutan flourishing? How is the United States flourishing? I think we looked at something a while back, maybe covered it in like one of the episodes of this that we'd never published, but it was about like where the United States ranked on a lot of these kind of flourishing metrics. And it was super low in a lot of the categories that we would not want to be low in. I'll dig that up and put it in the show notes too, for lack of my specificity. But no, I think this is interesting. One thing we talked about this weekend is how flourishing is a really bipartisan word. And right now, I think some people think it's kind of a right-leaning word because it's been injected into a lot of like the executive order on AI talks about human flourishing, and like it's started to be incorporated in those places. But at risk of making it like too flat, it is pretty incredible that we've started with early American documents about the pursuit of happiness. We're still keeping flourishing in there as this really core component of what it means to be alive, and like sort of thriving, flourishing, whatever the word is, you can kind of swap them out. But yeah, I think this is important work. I think it's a global indicator. And one last piece on this at risk of going too long, but the poet named Ross Gay has a book called Inciting Joy. He's sort of viewed as like this real poet of joy, this person who's always sort of exuding joy. And the whole book is really complicating what the word joy means. It's like grief is joy because like you had such a deep relationship with someone that it's like such a beautiful thing to be able to do. And so I think one piece that gets missed a lot in this is the bidirectionality of some of these. Like, I have strong relationships. That is not always going to be a good thing. Like, some days that will feel really negative. And some
Right.
days that's going to, but you like at a distance, that's like the reason that we live, like to share and to lose and to love and etc.
Yeah.
So I just really, as I'm circling these conversations, I'm always trying to hold it in this sort of fraught, fleeting light of just like, this is the beauty of life. And depending on the day, even if a lot of these things feel true to me, etc., it won't feel like that every day, even if technically they are sort of things that I have fulfilled, for lack of a better word. So
Yeah, I mean, that's really an important point, I guess, is that the idea is not that every person would feel like success would be every person on these 6 different parameters would feel 100% all the time.
yep.
It is a long-term target so that you are in trajectory moving in a direction that you have stronger relationships with people. And yeah, that comes with angst, and it comes with sadness and grief and all those kind of things. But the idea of
Mm,
trajectory of moving from no social relationships with people to close social relationships with other people. Now, AI throws a little bit of a loop in here because I was listening to something the other day about an AI predictor, and they were just saying like more and more relationships are going to be AI relationships, the most important relationships for humans. And we talked a little bit about this. We don't need to go into it now, but this idea that how does AI play a role in this, or universal basic income? How does that play a role in material and financial stability? So anyway, I like the idea of something that feels more bipartisan. It feels like globally people can agree on it. I agree. I've done some work in Bhutan in partnership with that country, and I've been over there a few times, and it really is. Gross national happiness shows up everywhere. It shows up in their curriculum. It shows up on the walls of the schools,
mm,
and it shows up in the policy. And so it truly is a lived experience that is embedded in the education system, which then becomes part of the culture of the country. And it's a very different way to look at it because it's an opposite, not opposite, but a much broader view than just say gross domestic product or GDP or something like that.
yes. Very importantly so. All right, Nate, take us into your next deep dive.
I have just a couple things I've been thinking about. This one sort of ties a little bit into this flourishing and maybe on social relationships, but I've been thinking a little bit about the purpose of education, really small topic, right?
Yeah, it's
And,
much
and,
faster than the other ones we've
yeah,
been
that's
talking.
right. So, but I've been reading a little bit about this idea of tribalism and thinking about groups that are different. And I'm reading a book right now on the sort of the history of Israel from 1900 to the present, right? Right, like 2023 or something. It was published in
Yeah.
2023. And how there were so many groups that evolved in that country and emerged in that country that were, more left leaning or more right leaning or from different parts of the world or whatever the case may be. No different than the United States, and no different than partisanship, and really no different than any human organization since humans emerged in the evolutionary landscape. Is
Hmm.
that we form tribes, and tribes are around people with common beliefs, and originally it was common location, but it's more and more about common beliefs. And I guess I'm going to present a hypothesis and see what you think. Is the purpose of school to actually combat tribalism that's evolutionary by nature? We clump with people that are the same as us, or that have similar beliefs, to form diverse communities that are in focus on the common good across tribes.
Hmm.
Because are we always combating this concept of tribalism? And can school play a function, especially the public sector where everybody goes? Can it play a function when we do projects and we do think about impact and purpose and all these pieces? These are all common good type things. We've talked about how do you become community minded rather than individual minded. And I'm wondering if tribalism and individual mindedness is something that's inherent in humans. And by introducing school, especially school that is more common good focused and purpose focused, we actually are combating that idea that we need to be in tribes. And one more
Hmm.
caveat before you jump in is that I don't think all tribes are bad either. I think like there's all sorts of tribes that are good. I just wonder if that's a tendency that if we want to get to the common good and make sure people really are thinking about the common good, we need to actually think about how are we moving across tribes in interesting ways. So there's my hypothesis for you to take and pick apart.
Yeah, definitely a short section of this podcast.
Yeah, right. Super short.
So I think a couple of things. So I think in general, the theory of like what matters is what we measure. Sort of, I don't think we measure what matters, but I do think what matters is what we measure in the end. And so because all of that is individual achievement, I think that's a pretty big part of this equation, right? Like within schools, especially,
Okay.
it is at the level of the
Agreed.
individual for success. And that is going to have a definite forcing mechanism on the broader picture. I also think culturally, tribes can be really different depending on who you're talking to. Like I grew up in the suburbs of Kansas City, and my tribe was like my nuclear family pretty much. Like there was
Yep.
not a lot of sort of village mentality to raising me or anything. And I think because we've set up some of these arbitrary smaller chunks into tribes, it becomes much harder to have like a permeable wall between tribes.
Mm.
And so the level of like if a whole school community formed a tribe and that included everybody in like the sort of the parents, the families, the
Mm.
other siblings, like, I think that's actually kind of a beautiful result of school. I just don't think that that happens given both the scale of certain systems and because of the ways in which we have sort of walled off so many things into smaller tribal units. So I I like the provocation, and I think the definition of tribes is challenging because the grain size can be so different. I think that this is I do think like I don't remember if we talked about this before, but I was listening to something about the right kind of conversations to bridge difference, and the question that they always ask their family at like Thanksgiving or whatever is, who do you feel responsible to, or who do you feel
Mm.
responsible for? And I think that that's like a really beautiful question that starts to gesture at tribes, this idea of accountability, rather than the people that you always find yourself sitting by, like at lunch, say. And I think that those kind of questions, it's actually not I think they should be asked younger. I think we should be asking people when they're younger, like, who do you feel responsible to and for? And if you just have like 1 to 2 answers, I think that's actually something that you start to interrogate deeper and be like, oh, maybe this is the way that we don't encounter the Thomas Putnam bowling alone challenge or all these other kind of civic challenges we're talking about now.
I was thinking a little bit about tribes versus communities. Is there a difference there? I think this is something we need to explore more. Is I'm trying to find some through line around why is it hard for us to always to think about purposeful and common good learning?
Yeah.
And I think you pointed at one thing is that our system measures the individual success, and actually America as a United States as a country is very much
Yeah.
programmed around individual success. And that's not true in all countries. But in the United States it is. And I wonder if so that's a national sort of mentality. But I'm also thinking, is there a historic evolutionary thing that
Mhm.
we're pushing against here?
I think that's true, and I think that there's a question that still stands, which was brought up at this last weekend when I was hanging out with some civics folks. Is like, what does it mean to be patriotic today, and what does it mean to be a witness of somebody else's patriotism in like a different tribe? So if
Yeah.
like somebody raised the provocation that was like, hey, I was recently at this event, and it was a parade in a small town, and like the parade came down the street and people were twirling rifles and cheering and young like kids had popsicles and like this classic image of a parade in a small town, and everyone was feeling a certain way. And then she was like, and I was in Banff, Canada, like I wasn't in the United States.
Ah,
And does that make you feel different knowing it's Banff? And like I think especially in this moment that we're in, made a lot of people feel really different to know that was somewhere else. They had like a
huh.
little piece with some of that imagery. So I think this idea of it, what happens when a tribe meets a tribe or when a community meets a community, and how do you make that a bridge rather than a division is
Yeah.
a really, really valuable question to be grappling with.
Yeah. It's like all that the weavers work, right? Who are the people in the
Totally.
community that are weaving together? And you and I have talked about this, and it's especially with the internet and social media and now AI amplifying the slop that's out there, is this is going to become harder and harder. So I think education institutions are going to have to work harder and harder to help young people see that we can work across difference, that we can work, you can be in a tribe and you can work in community towards the common good. So
Yep.
placeholder for that, good pushback and thoughts and additions there. My only other one was just I was doing a little bit of work on our framework and thinking about the strategy part of our framework, which sits in the middle of our 5 different elements. And strategy can happen when you are determining community vision. It can happen when you're building outcomes. It can happen when you're building your learning model. Strategy happens all over the place. And I was thinking about the sub elements under strategy and the importance that you and I and at Getting Smart we've talked about a lot, which I think collectively I think we still have a deficit in the education system, which is around project management. Is
Yep.
that if you are effectively going to take a vision and move it into actuality and into a strategy, you need people that have really good project management skills. So I dove into the literature and I was sort of interested in who's done research on this. And there's actually been a ton of research. And Project Management Institute we've worked with or partnered with or had relationships with in the past. And they do good work about how do you do high quality project management. But it really hasn't, I don't think, permeated the education system, either in educator development or in students and courses, with the exception of project-based learning, right? So we do project-based learning, but I'm not sure how often in project-based learning, we have what's the essential question and what's the reflection time. There's not a whole lot in there around project management from some of the frameworks. And so Angela Evan, who we can put this in the show notes, who's from Purdue University Global, wrote this article. And the article was just about that helping teachers develop project management skills would be a really good thing. Good thing for the teachers, good thing for students who all of them need project management skills. And we'll probably be managing AI agents in the future, which will need even better project management skills. But there's some really good resources in there about the impact of when you teach students project management skills, they actually gain in all sorts of areas. And so how do we become way more explicit in our instruction, project-based learning, or in any learning experiences that, hey, we're learning how to manage a project here. What does that mean? It has concrete goals. We're going to set metrics and targets, blah, 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 blah. All those things that are really important that we use day to day.
Yep.
But I never was taught that in school. I learned that on the job when I first started teaching. I'm like, I better figure out how to manage this because this is hard to do. And so it's just something I've been thinking about is how do we're going to amplify it and elevate it in our framework because we think it's important, but just wondering if you agree with that. Have you seen other things around that you're thinking about in this area?
I mean, I totally agree with it. And I will say I had a couple of project-based experiences in school, but all of them were I guess a couple of them were self-directed. So maybe I had a little bit of that, like if I don't work ahead, then I'm working behind. But there is a lot of the time when you're given a project, you have such set deadlines to have certain things turned in by that you're actually not really doing any of the valuable project management work of actually figuring out how to stay ahead, how to deliver on time. It makes me think of when I visited Redbridge in San Francisco, and they do really incredible project management education with like K2 kids. And it'll be like, you have to demonstrate a competency by X time. Let's work backwards to figure out like where you need to be along the way so that you can deliver. And then the young person is able to demonstrate their competency when they feel ready. If they finish early, great. If they finish late, then they have a conversation with the facilitator. But that's incredible that they're having K2 students back map from a timeline to say, these are the things I need to do to get there on time. I really do think it's valuable. And everything is going to be a complex, as Tom says, it's a complex project with diverse teams and smart tools. Like that's such an important bridging and communication skill. It's almost like a new language for how you work with people, and everything's a project now.
Yeah, and everything's a project, and yet I think I would go back to my first claim is that we actually don't do that well. And
No, not at
Redbridge is
all.
a great example, and they have a lot that they could share, and certainly listeners could go and check them out and connect with them if they want more. But it should be like a lot of things we think that should be core that aren't yet core yet. It should be core for every student in the K-12 system, is that you start early, you learn about projects, you learn how to manage them, which then allows you to develop agency, which then sits nicely in a personalized classroom where you can think about co-design of your own projects as you get older and older and doing things that are purposeful and meaningful for you and the community, as we talked about before. Things
Good
to
stuff.
think about. All right, let's wrap here with the signs of human expression. What are the things that anything that on your end that you were thinking about?
Yeah, a thought and a question. So earlier I referenced that conversation Tyler Cowen had with David Robertson, classical music composer. And he was asking these really interesting questions about trying to take classical music into the field of management. So he was basically saying, like, how do you communicate good job to your orchestra while you're performing? And how do you, like, when do people look at you? Like, when do people come to you for advice, basically, during a performance? Which is I'm obsessed with the metaphor of the conductor forever.
Yeah.
I think it's so interesting. But he said two things that I think are really beautiful and interesting, aside from the one I shared at the beginning. He said, one, that a conductor must quickly memorize when they join a new orchestra when each member of the orchestra looks up at a piece and every person looks up at a different time. So it's like
Interesting.
right before someone plays,
Yeah.
right after someone plays, when they've done something correctly, when they do something wrong. Like your goal is to be eye contact at the perfect moment. And I think that is like a really beautiful metaphor for what a good facilitator or a good educator does. Is it's like, what is the kind of poetic interpretation of someone looking up at you? and how are you meeting them in that moment? So I loved that. And then the other piece was on the subject of how do you tell someone something's good when someone thinks good. He said, like, in an orchestra, the players don't look at each other. That's like kind of not what you're supposed to do. And so your role as a conductor is to basically emote so big that you can show the whole orchestra when someone's done something well. So you're always being this like channel of what is beautiful in front of you and happening. And so you're kind of elevating without language great moments and also meeting people in their moments of need or their moments of celebration. And it's all improvisational and beautiful. And I just loved it. So I'm sitting with that today. I'm curious if that, does any of that resonate with you on like a soccer field as a coach? Are you ever like, what is that version of this kind of
Yeah, that's
live?
interesting. I think the version is, as a coach, unlike an orchestra, I, I think that only the players near you actually get good feedback, like direct in process or in game feedback, because the field's too big. So and the position of a coach is on the sideline, so they can't connect with all players in midstream. So it's probably a little different, and it's probably different on purpose because most sports, but soccer, when I coach, is improvisational. They're making hundreds and hundreds of decisions on the field. Whereas if you're in an orchestra and you're playing the oboe, you're reading this organism of music around you, and the conductor's trying to work with the organism rather than the individuals, even though he or she or they have to work on the individuals.
So maybe it's more like a football or something where you are following plays and people are making decisions on the fly, but like it is sort of a scripted set of things that the players on the field are doing.
Totally. Cool. Super interesting. I'll just finish with one that I think I'm interested in this idea of what does good leadership look like, and can compassion and empathy show up in leadership? And I think there's some real discussions in the world of leadership and the world of politics about what a good leader is. And we go back and forth about, do they have to be tough and non-empathetic and stoic, or can they be empathetic and kind and be a strong leader? And so a couple different things here that struck me. One was I was reading an article about the ex-prime minister of Jacinda Ardern of New Zealand, and she was preaching just about that she's really working on, it's okay to show compassion as a national leader, and that's an okay thing to do. And she gets a lot of pushback on that. So that was inspiring to me about making sure that as humans we're thinking about empathy. And then I was listening to Reid Hoffman, and he talked about AI being super humane because they can mimic empathy, and the idea that there's a lot of people that get no empathy in this world, and that really struggles. And so this may be a positive output if you have someone who doesn't have someone that's compassionate, that you are in your friend circles or have no friends or whatever, that there is some part of AI that can serve that role, even though there's all sorts of negative challenges with AI partners. And I think the last thing was a research project as I was digging into empathy, about that empathy in 2018, scientists discovered that 10% of empathy is genetic, which to me means that 90% is environment, which means that empathy can be taught to any human being if only 10% is genetics. And I think that was encouraging. So when you look at leaders that are saying, hey, we can be a great leader and be empathetic at the same time, what role does AI play? And is there a positive part of this? And that the fact that research says is that this can be taught and developed, and we can do that. And that's encouraging and hopeful for me, because I think it's something that's really critically human, is this idea of empathy.
Totally. And absolutely is relevant for our flourishing conversation. So that kind of means that anyone can flourish, which is great.
Right. And speaking of flourishing, let's go to our song.
The chalkboard's gone replaced by a screen, a glass don't glow, a technicolor sheen. The books are dust, the desks look so bare. Where did the papers go? They're floating in the air. We're catching up, oh catching up to futures bright, but oh so abrupt. The lessons change, times won't stop, but we're always catching up, catching up. The teacher's voice now a pixel parade, hologram parents teaching math in the shade. The playground's quiet, the kids all inside, learning to code while their imaginations hide. We're catching up, oh catching up, to futures bright, but oh so abrupt. The lessons change, times won't stop, we're always catching up, catching up. Do they dream in binary, or still count sheep? Do they wonder if the past has secrets to keep? When the world spins fast, can they still slow down? Or will they lose themselves in the digital sound? We're catching up, oh catching up, to futures bright, but oh so abrupt. The lessons change, times won't stop, we're always catching up, catching up.
Amazing. That's outstanding. I'm very impressed. I feel like on most kind of live jazz combo recordings, you can feel the space between the instruments, and sometimes the piano is kind of like weirdly quiet and feels like it's over in the corner, and then sometimes it's a little more front when they're taking the lead, and that bass was just like very present but also subdued. So impressive soundscape for an AI generation. I felt like I was there with the jazz combo.
So you got it right, sort of jazz nightclub type thing. And
Yeah.
my inspiration was that they do these free Shakespeare festivals in Jackson. And so Rachel and I went to one last night, and it was 12th night. It was set in a 60s to 70s sort of beach resort with some castaways. Like, that was the setting of it. But then they had the singer at the beach resort was a jazz singer, and she would always come in and sing exactly that style of singing. So
I love it. I love that. Well, thank you, Nate. Pleasure as always. And have a great couple weeks. I'll see you again soon. Catch up more.
Yeah.
Thanks for tuning in to the Getting Smart podcast today. We want this podcast to be actionable, insightful, and a great way to learn about what's next in learning. In order to stay on the cutting edge, we need people in the field to tell us what they're hearing, what they're wanting, and what they're needing to learn more about. Got a topic or a guest in mind? Send your recommendations to me, Mason at gettingsmart.com. And if you like what you're hearing, don't forget to leave a review in Apple Podcasts or subscribe wherever you listen. Feel free to share the podcast on social media using the hashtag GSPodcasts. Thanks so much.